There's a story that has lived on over the decades in my long friendship with John, who lives on Long Island. John had recently, this is like 3 decades ago, this is before I moved to San Francisco, and there are probably other disclaimers. This is before I married Ellen, and so like her judgment is not impugned by my actions in this story. John took this new job, and he was working for Amtrak, and it meant that he traveled. He traveled, and he would get home like the wee hours of the morning, as they say. So I had this idea that somehow, which you don't necessarily think these things through, somehow I would obtain a mannequin, and he would come home and find a mannequin in his bed. Now, he was renting, so you need all of your ducks in a row, as they say. So he was renting a room from a couple that I knew. They were maybe closer to my parents' age than mine. Anyway, so I got them in on this. Maybe you should question their judgment more than my own judgment. But see, you don't think this through, because in order to obtain a mannequin, you must go to said store and ask for a mannequin. Which, if I had like an image of the looks that I got, I think we went to several places, and then I started to settle for mannequin parts. I would go into one and I would say, I've got a head and I've got a torso. Do you happen to have a spare leg? Anyway, it's just one of these ideas that seem rational until you try to execute it. We spare no expense. He had this old typewriter. I remember, I could see the room. He had this old manual typewriter. So we put in some colored paper and typed him a letter from said mannequin. We cut out heart-shaped construction paper, scattered it from the doorway. Yes, it was quite the image. The sad thing is, I was not there when John opened the door in the wee hours of the morning and said, "Oh my God, there's a woman in my bed." Thank you, Jensa, for giving us this brief tour of these significant moments that have a special bearing on Ruth's story. Ruth could easily have become invisible and powerless in this foreign land, in a patriarchal society. Boaz sees her, and he knows from her earlier confession to Naomi that she has placed herself in the care of her God. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Boaz heard this story because he refers to it and admires her for it. Her desire to be grafted into this covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. The passage from chapter 2 that Jensa read highlights an earlier conversation that Boaz has with Ruth. And in it, he prays or speaks a blessing over her, that God would honor her and reward her, and that she would find shelter under God's wings. We have echoes of Psalm 91. You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Our story takes an interesting turn. Naomi is not only a mother-in-law, she is an advocate for Ruth. And she says at the beginning of chapter 3, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. And you get this sense that there's this great deal of love between these two women. And as a Jew, Naomi is aware of those things in her culture that tether them to the security of her community and to God's provision. But it seems there's something for them to do. They have to be courageous and bring things to light. Now, we don't know if the kinsman redeemer hasn't stepped up by now because Ruth is a Moabite, or perhaps because she continues to wear the clothes that mark her grief, or that somehow the system had failed her. We don't know. But Naomi tells Ruth, get cleaned up, change your clothes. And it seems like Naomi is saying, put on your Sunday best. I need you to put your best foot forward. But we miss a significant part of what's going on in Ruth's life, which we talked about last week. She has been in mourning. And as with today, in many cases, when people are attending a memorial service, a funeral perhaps, or are in mourning, they dress in black. Unique clothes designated to be a part of embodying this season that they're walking through. So when Naomi says, change your clothes, get cleaned up, she's saying it's time for you to express your desire to be redeemed. Now, there clearly are power dynamics at work in this culture. For many women then and many now, their security lies in a husband. Whether safety, financial security, relational connection, as we look in on this story, we feel Ruth's vulnerability. And we might even wonder, Naomi, what are you doing? What are you suggesting in having Ruth get all dressed up and stealthily go to the granary at night and uncover Boaz's feet? We can't help but feel the risk, the vulnerability, maybe the boldness. But there Ruth goes, and she waits, I'm sure with her heart beating fast, till Boaz lays down. She's not wanting to be seen on her way in or be noticed by anyone else but him. Now, I think about this story, and I've wrestled with this story. Part of the reason I've wrestled with this story is reading commentary writers about this story. Some express the kind of desperation that Ruth felt, and others project some kind of sexual proposition by Ruth into the circumstances of this late night plan. And some go so far as to suggest that uncovering the feet is actually a euphemism for something more. And I have to admit, I found it very difficult to digest this. The upside was it sent me on kind of an exegetical journey, looking for like what is the meaning in this story. And so then we pick up the story which Jensa read from verse 8 in chapter 3. It says, at midnight, the man, Boaz, was startled, and he turns over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. And he asks the practical question, who are you? Because, there are no lights. So whatever it meant for her to dress up really had no impact on Boaz whatsoever. And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. So Boaz wakes up to the chill on his feet and the awareness that someone is near him, and is shocked to find it's a woman. And there's Ruth. And I imagine over these hours that he has been sleeping comfortably, she has been awake very uncomfortably. And she's kind of rehearsed in her mind, what am I going to say? Like, what's my line? And she says this, I am Ruth, spread your cloak over your servant. What she is saying is, if we were to paraphrase for ourselves, she's asking Boaz to marry her. And he gathers himself and says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. He's referring to her loyalty to Naomi. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. Powerful. Boaz is, like, in one sense, in awe. And he feels honored by her proposal. And I imagine for her, as he starts to speak to her, she realizes she's not been misunderstood, and she's not been taken advantage of. And in fact, Boaz holds her in such high regard. It's so beautiful. And I thought when he said, all the people think you are this worthy woman, and I thought, well, I wondered for a moment, I just wondered for a moment how much it has to do with the way he sees her and the way he has talked about her. He continues, but now, though it is true, I am a near kinsman to you, there is another that is closer to you. And he tells her, as soon as it's daybreak, I'm going to find the city elders. I'm going to find this kinsman who is closer to you than I am, and I will advocate for you. Now, I want us to remember again the blessing that Boaz prayed for her. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. And now I take you to the place I ended up on my exegetical journey. I ended up in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, where what's being described is God's betrothal to Israel. I read this where God says to Israel, I spread the edge of my cloak over you. The word here in Hebrew is kanaf. It is used for the wings of cherubim and seraphim. It also takes on the sense of the outer edges of a garment, the corners, the extremities of something, whether it's living or inanimate. If you were to look this up, it might refer you to 1 Samuel 15:27, where King Saul is in a heap of trouble because he's disobeyed the prophet Samuel. And Samuel comes and rebukes him And then when Samuel has said what he wants to say, he turns to leave Saul, and Saul grabs the hem of his garment and tears it off. But I love this imagery of God saying, I spread the edge of my cloak over you. And I couldn't help but think of the woman with the issue of blood in the Gospels who said, if I only touch the hem of his garment, I would be made whole. And so when Ruth says to Boaz, with what seems like a degree of boldness, to spread your cloak over me, she's basically echoing what he said. And as soon as the day breaks, Boaz carries out his promise. He goes to the elders and he asks the closest kinsman to redeem the land. And he seems more than willing until Boaz, I think Boaz kind of set him up. Because he says, oh yeah, you could acquire this land. And he's like, sure, why wouldn't I? Oh yes. And Ruth and Naomi, and then suddenly he became less interested. He didn't want his life complicated. And I ultimately think this is the outcome that Boaz wanted. So he says to the elders after this agreement has come to be, today you are witnesses that I have acquired the land that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon, including Ruth, the wife of Mahlon. And I love what he says, what he articulates, which was like embedded in the culture, that it includes Ruth to be his wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, so that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. So there is a way in which him becoming the kinsman redeemer, and this is really so much at the heart of it, is so that her husband's name will not be forgotten and that she would be cared for. And then I love it because the elders say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And I like to imagine things, so I imagine Boaz making the walk to the field, because I'm sure Ruth is back working in the field, wondering about the outcome, and she sees him approaching, and she's feeling all kinds of feelings, and then he gets closer enough to her and smiles at her. And I don't know, like, what do you do in a situation like that? Does she embrace him? Does he embrace her? But I imagine, and I thought of this, I imagine, because we're in those moments where something happens on our behalf and we feel kind of a strength go through our body, like this sort of, maybe it's a kind of resilience, but something goes through us where we suddenly, we feel something. And as I thought about it, the strength that Ruth is feeling was already there. This whole story of Ruth has told us what an amazing person she is. Joan Chittister writes, the moment a woman takes action to shape her world for her own sake, she comes to the point where she knows herself to be a creative force in it. She goes on to say, the moment a woman comes home to herself, the moment she knows that she has become a person of influence, an artist for her life, a sculptor of her universe, a person with rights and responsibilities who is respected and recognized, the resurrection of the world begins. You see, the beauty of this union that forms between Boaz and Ruth was present long before the union took place. And Joan Chittister adds, when men and women can see another's gifts, They see other aspects of God's image, aspects they themselves don't reflect. Then women and men become collaborators in what it means to be human. There's something interesting about this story. Because Boaz is not a sibling of Mahlon and Chilion, he is not required to do this. He's not. There's room for it, but there's not the kind of this sense of obligation, which makes this story even more beautiful. But there is a way in which Ruth walks to the edges of what the system provides. She walks to the edges, and there she says, "This is what I would like." So there is a way in which, yes, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, but it is Ruth that advocates for her own redemption. And in a beautiful way, the story of Ruth amplifies her voice. Now, to discover, as Paul Harvey, for those of you who remember the radio voice, would say, and now for the rest of the story. To discover the rest of the story, it lives well beyond the pages of this small book. If we turn to Matthew chapter 1, to the genealogy of Jesus, it begins this way: an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then we scan down to verses 5 and 6. And Salmon, all these names that we kind of gloss over. We're just like, blah, 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 blah. And so-and-so begat so-and-so. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of the king David. That's right. Yes, her name finds its way into the lineage of King David. She's grandma. And into the story of Jesus generations later. And so in the large arc of history, her life becomes the womb of God's unfolding, redeeming work. So what does this mean for us? Well, I think there is a way in which we are invited into this kind of advocacy. Whether it's Ruth's fidelity, or Naomi's advocacy, or Boaz's influence, or Ruth's courage, or Boaz's compassion. And there is a way in which this kind of agency embodies Jesus' very own advocacy for us. Joy was sharing at the way Jesus embraced suffering, trauma. And there is a way in which, amidst what I don't want to be lost, which is the way in which we are called to and can be, in really beautiful ways, advocates for each other, we are reflecting Jesus' own advocacy for us. He is our kinsman redeemer. And he desires to cover us. And sometimes that covering is a covering that touches the desperate parts in our life, the places that we feel invisible or powerless. There are other places where we need to hear the message that Jesus is wanting to cover us. I think of Adam and Eve. They're hiding with their inadequate fig leaves, and God comes walking in the garden, and he says, "Oh, no, I have something much better prepared for you." And so there's a way sometimes that we need to open ourselves in vulnerability to the way that God wants to show up in our lives, and to not live at arm's length from God in our self-sufficiency, and we have the answers, and we would much rather be in control than to choose vulnerability. So God invites us to bring our broken places and our dreams, our wounds, all of it to him. And there's a way in which God invites us into a partnership in our own becoming. Right? I think the beauty of this story is Ruth was a partner with God. Whatever she knew about God, whatever she understood about the traditions in Judaism, she became a partner with God, a courageous partner with God in her own becoming. And we are invited into that as well. We have to be vulnerable and ask for what we need. We need to get to those places where we realize our efforts alone, while sincere and devoted and loving, are inadequate to save us or form us. We need, in fresh ways, to say to God, cover me, cover me. I need you to cover me.